All right, I'm going to be going through period 6, which starts in 1865 and goes until 1898. Focuses heavily on the Gilded Age, which is a time of great industrial expansion. Probably more for this period than any other period. I'm going to be talking about some topics or themes that weren't covered as intensely in class because the Gilded Age, I think, can sometimes be very complicated with its multiple layers. So let's first start with the first layer, which is actually expansion. This is a time of westward expansion again. We had the Civil War, which kind of broke apart the expansion period up beforehand. Before the Civil War, you had the Mexican-American War. And then after the Civil War, you're going to have things like the purchasing of Alaska, where you're seeing America begin to continue to expand out west. And the reason why we're wanting to expand out west is mainly so we can find more economic markets. It's going to be China, as well as trying to find natural resources. That's mainly sugar in the Caribbean, and then also military installations, being able to sell military bases like we did with Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. So Alaska is our first um, venture into that idea of expanding beyond our borders. And it was largely seen as a failure, although later it is going to become very successful. And we'll talk about why that is at the very end of this period. All right. So continuing this theme, you're going to have in 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad's completed. This is going to cause for more settlers to move out west, which is going to have a bad effect or an adverse effect on Native Americans. The more white people moving out west, the worse it is for Native Americans. 1871, this is where we bring up the Native Americans. It's the Indian Appropriation Act. The Indian Appropriation Act stated that Native Americans would no longer be treated as sovereign nations. Each Native American nation used to be treated as its own country. 1871, this is the United States saying that they are not going to do that anymore, which is going to lead to lots of tension and eventually the Native American Wars. 1872 to 1877, this starts the other major theme of this time period, which is going to be this conflict between East Coast businesses and Western farmers. East Coast businesses, you're going to be thinking about your coastal elites, the Rockefellers, the robber barons, things like that, who control the railroads. And the railroads are so important because it's what the farmers are going to have to be putting their food supply on to send it back to the East Coast. Additionally, farmers are going to have to take out lots of loans during this time from banks. And where are the banks located? The banks are located on the East Coast. So in 1872, farmers tried to begin to protect themselves with something called the Granger movement. And this was what's called a co-op, which is where a bunch of farmers came together and it basically tried to establish their own banks to lead to protection against East Coast banks. 1872, you're going to have the Credit Mobiliar scandal. This is a series of scandals that took place when Ulysses Grant was president. He is going to be kind of known for these scandals, even though he wasn't directly involved with them. They all happened under his watch. And again, this is going to kind of show some distrust in politics at this time. So what happened was there was a railroad company that had to hire a construction company. And instead of hiring a construction company, they actually just created their own construction company and hired themselves. They were able to overcharge for goods. Congress found out about it. They bribed them. It became a whole thing. This just shows that businesses are controlling politics during this time. And businesses had unprecedented growth during this time. Businesses are going to grow a lot. You have the biggest businesses or the biggest businessmen, the robber barons. And the government's really not doing anything to stop it. And that's kind of the third big theme. So then you're going to have the Panic of 1873. And what this was, it was a big depression during this time. This kind of killed Ulysses Grant's presidency. And this happened mainly because railroad companies began to overexpand. There were too many railroad companies. They took out loans that they couldn't pay back. And this also begins to set up this tension between poor people who are dramatically affected by these banks closing and by these panics, and the wealthy individuals that they feel like caused them. This is going to happen twice in this period, 1873 and then 1893. The other scandal that Grant is most known for being involved in is the whiskey ring scandal. This is where a bunch of whiskey distilleries out west decided not to pay taxes on their product. And again, while Grant was not directly involved with it, it does seem like a lot of the people that he appointed were involved with it. This picture right here is kind of highlighting that. And this is Grant right here kind of holding this thing that says corruption and all these people that are actually doing the corruption behind him. All right, 1876, you have the Battle of the Little Bighorn. This is going to be a Native American battle where they actually win. The Native Americans are going to defeat General Custer. They destroyed Custer and his men, and it set up a prolonged period of where Native Americans are being forced onto these reservations without their consent. 1877, again, you're seeing this conflict between laborers and the big companies that employ them, and you should be able to see right now that railroads are a huge deal, and so there was this big national railroad strike. It went on for a very long time. Some states had to deploy their militias to get the strike back together, and this is just a preview of a lot of the tension had between big companies and their workers. 1881, you have Helen Hunt Jackson's Century of Dishonor. It's a book that she published that basically said the U.S. government's on the wrong side of history when it comes to Native American relationships, that we've abused Native Americans and that Native Americans need to be treated better. 1882, you have some of this nativism and backlash taking place that we've seen previously, and that's going to be mainly with the Chinese. The Chinese actually helped build a lot of the railroads out west, but in doing so, they undercut a lot of the white workers. They would work for much cheaper. This brought up this big idea that Native Americans were taking, or that the Chinese were taking their jobs. And so because of that, eventually a Natives campaign is going to have it to be where the Chinese are going to be kicked out of the United States all the way up until 1943. 1882, businesses are expanding even more with Standard Oil's trust. This is the first trust that's created. A trust is a merger of companies. And this is a great view of how people kind of saw Standard Oil, how you can see Standard Oil, where it's this big company and it's using its tentacles to come out and take over other things as well. And this picture is really showing that it's taking over politics. All right. 1886, you have the Haymarket Square riot. This is another big protest between laborers and the company, although this had a big impact because there was a bomb that was dropped at the Haymarket riot, killed several police officers. People blamed anarchists, and some anarchists were known to be part of the Knights of Labor. So all of a sudden, the Knights of Labor became set up by this, and the Knights of Labor is going to die from this. And it's going to be replaced with the American Federation of Labor, set up by Samuel Gompers, which was a labor union. So this is supposed to protect laborers from businesses. 1887 is the Interstate Commerce Act. This was another way to try to control railroads. So you can see that there's some attempt to try to swing the balance of power back towards the laborers. So this is supposed to control railroad rates to make farmers happy. The problem became the people who actually got in charge of this were a lot of former railroad officials. So they weren't exactly fair in their rate supply. 1887, you have the Dawes Act. No picture, my bad. But the Dawes Act is going to be a Native American act where Native Americans are going to be asked to assimilate. And the biggest way they're going to be asked to assimilate is going to be they're going to be told to move on to individual pieces of land that will be theirs forever. They're trying to get them away from this idea of collective living, that tribal living that Native Americans were doing. 1889, The Gospel of Wealth is published by Andrew Carnegie, and this is his idea that wealthy people, Carnegie was insanely wealthy, need to take care of the community and society, that they need to be doing beneficial things. And one of the biggest ways that he did this is he built a bunch of libraries for his workers. July 14th, 1889. I don't have the event written down there, but I know that that is the Hull House. The Hull House was created. This was for immigrant women to be able to go to get services in Chicago. The cities were very, very poor during this time, and this was to provide them with those services. 1890, How the Other Half Lives is published. This was written by a guy named Jacob Riis, and it showed how horrible city living was for poor people. So again, trying to highlight what it was truly like to be a poor laborer and how bad it was for those people, especially immigrants. July 1890, the Sherman Antitrust Act is created, and this is designed to try to contain monopolies. It actually states that monopolies are made illegal, although it's not going to be heavily followed during this time. And again, that's one thing I want you to see from this. The government is attempting to kind of take control back from businesses, but they're not effective, and it's not going to be effective until the Progressive Era. Great example is the Sherman Antitrust Act. This made monopolies illegal, but no one really started to enforce this actually until Teddy Roosevelt in the 1900s. In fact, the Sherman Antitrust Act was first really used to actually disband a lot of labor unions. So something that was supposed to control businesses actually ends up hurting labor, which is really symbiotic of a big symbol of the period. 1890, we kind of have the end of the Native American Wars with Wounded Knee. This is where the U.S. government killed 200 unarmed, mostly unarmed women, children, and men that were Native Americans that were Sioux. And this is kind of the last big armed conflict between Native Americans and the United States government. After this, the United States government supplied reservations, or they had supplied reservations, and Native Americans lived on those reservations. 1891, we're seeing this expansion also take place with the annexation of Hawaii. Hawaii becomes a territory, not a state yet. They don't become a state until 1950. And it's going to be very, very beneficial in the Spanish-American War, which is the last event for this, because it was a place that we could take our military to, park it there, refuel, and then continue onward to fight in the Philippines. And we realized how valuable that was going to be. 1892, Ellis Island is created. We had a mass influx of immigrants during this time because of all these new jobs, because of these big industries on the East Coast. They needed cheap labor, and immigrants were that source of cheap labor. So you're having a lot of immigrants move over. Very important to note, these immigrants are different than previous waves of immigrants because almost none of them were British. They're all Central European, so German, Southern, which are going to be Italians, and then you also had Eastern Europeans, so that's Russians and Polish Jews. 1892, the Homestead Steel Strike. This was a big violent steel strike that took place, just another example of labor conflict. And 1892, you had the Populist Party created. So this is kind of the second coming of the Granger movement that we talked about, except this is going to be much more political. So this party was created for farmers who felt like the government was not listening to them. Now, it was a very short-lived party, but that's going to be mainly because a lot of their ideas are going to be adopted by the Democrats based in the South. Now, the Populist Party and the Democrats didn't get along great, mainly because the Populist Party was not super racist and the Democrat Party was, but eventually almost all the ideas of the Populist Party are going to be adopted, and I'll talk more about those ideas in just a second. So then we have the Panic of 1893. Now, what happened in the Panic of 1893? Again, there was a lot of instability in the market, but from the railroad companies, railroads were kind of falling apart. But this showed how connected our economy was to Europe at this point, because Europe and the United States were starting to do a lot of commerce together. This also set up a really, really big idea about currency. And I'm going to explain this just really quickly. We don't have an event for it, but it does affect our next couple of events. So there were two ideas. One was called free silver, and the other is called the gold standard. Now, we had been on the gold standard since 1873, the last panic. That was to kind of the resolve. And what that meant was that the US dollar money was backed by gold. The problem was there wasn't that much gold in the United States. So it made getting money very, very restrictive. There was a restrictive supply. People wanted for there to be this thing called free silver, which is where money wouldn't be backed by just gold, but it would also be backed by silver because we had a ton of silver. So there would be a bunch of money that would be able to enter into the market. Now, the economic principles behind that, you don't need to know. What you do want to know is who wanted what. Free silver was wanted by farmers. All right, you can think about poor farmers kind of wanting to have more money into the market. The gold standard was wanted by business. And the only reason why you can think about it this way is that the gold standard was wanted by business because the gold standard worked. And people like things that work. Businesses like stability. So they wanted something that was going to be stable. And that set up the big political debate during this time. Now, to just kind of finish off with westward expansion, July 1893, Frederick Jackson Turner published this idea called the Frontier Thesis. This stated that the American West was closed, that we had conquered everything that there was to conquer, and that we needed to continue to conquer things if we were going to be a growing society. And so that causes people to look out west or past the West, and what are the new areas that we can be getting. And this is a big, big lead into imperialism. Remember that this leads into imperialism. 1894, we had the Pullman strike. One of the biggest strikes in American history, Pullman train cars. And one thing to really remember about this is that the US government actually sends in military troops to stop this strike. And it showed that the US government totally backed businesses over workers. So even though there had been small things done to try to make rules for businesses, this really showed that the government still was backing businesses over workers. 1895, Booker T. Washington's Atlanta Compromise. This really sets up the idea of what Booker T. Washington believed in, which was this idea that African Americans should be focused more on economic gains as opposed to civil rights gains. And so what he believed African Americans should do is that they should specialize in the things that they were really, really good at already, and to make money in those things and not focus too much on trying to be equal with white people. That hasn't aged incredibly well. The famous line from this Atlanta Compromise, which was actually given where Piedmont Park is today, was cast down your bucket where you are, which is basically if you're a farmer, become a really, really successful farmer, and then eventually civil rights will come. The opposing view of this is W.E.B. Du Bois, and he believed that African Americans had to fight for civil rights. This sets up Plessy versus Ferguson, which was the Separate but Equal Act. So Homer Plessy tried to get on a train car and was sued, or was arrested. He sued, and this states that things can be separate by race as long as they're equal, and it doesn't violate the 14th Amendment. And then we have William McKinley elected president. Now, he was a Republican. So if you remember Republicans, they like the gold. They want gold standard. They're business focused. They also were big into tariffs. That's the North. They want protective tariffs. Democrats are the South. They're poor. They want silver, and they don't want tariffs. And so you can see right here, this really shows that he's on a gold coin, showing that he supports the gold standard. And it's for commerce and civilization. This reeks of East Coast elitism. This made the Democrats very sad. And then lastly, you have the Spanish-American War. This is our big imperialism event, really leads into the Panama Canal being built, other fortes into the Roosevelt Corollary, things like that. But the Spanish-American War really starts off with our imperialism era, because you're going to have the U.S. take all the Spanish possessions, all the Spanish territories, and that is Puerto Rico, Cuba, Guam, and the Philippines, although we will go to war with the Philippines after this because they wanted to be free. All right, and that is your timeline.